The metallic screech of twisted steel pierced the pre-dawn darkness as USS Samuel B. Roberts limped toward Portsmouth Naval Yard, her hull bearing a jagged wound that should have sent her to the bottom of the English Channel. It was May 28, 1944, just 9 days before the largest amphibious invasion in human history would either liberate Europe or drown in its own blood. Chief Petty Officer Marcus "Mac" O'Sullivan pressed his calloused palm against the ship's trembling bulkhead, feeling the vibrations that told him everything he needed to know. The destroyer escort was dying, and with her, perhaps the fate of Operation Overlord itself. Salt spray mixed with engine oil created a slick sheen on the deck as sailors rushed past him, their faces etched with the kind of terror that comes from knowing you're carrying a secret that could doom thousands. In his weathered hand, Mac clutched a small metal component, a seemingly insignificant screw, no bigger than his thumb, worth perhaps 5 cents in peacetime. Yet this tiny piece of steel held the power to unravel months of meticulous planning, expose the Allies' most closely guarded secrets, and hand Hitler the victory he desperately craved. The young ensign beside him, Tommy Richardson, barely 22 and fresh from the academy, stared at the approaching harbor with wide eyes that had already seen too much. Neither man knew that in the coming hours, they would face an impossible choice between duty and conscience, between saving lives and preserving the mission that could end the war. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, a coded message crackled through the radio room below, carrying orders that would test every principle they had sworn to uphold. The countdown to D-Day had begun, and failure was not an option, even if success demanded the unthinkable. The nightmare had begun 3 weeks earlier in the workshops beneath Portsmouth Naval Yard, where Chief Petty Officer Mac O'Sullivan hunched over blueprints that officially didn't exist. The Mulberry Harbor Project, portable artificial harbors designed to supply the invasion forces, represented the most audacious engineering feat in military history. Without them, the Allied forces landing on Normandy's beaches would wither and die, cut off from reinforcements and supplies. Mac's calloused fingers traced the technical specifications, his mind haunted by memories of his younger brother Danny, lost at Pearl Harbor when a single faulty valve had trapped him below decks. 3 years later, Mac still woke screaming his brother's name, still felt the crushing weight of survivor's guilt. He had transferred to engineering not from passion, but from an obsessive need to ensure that mechanical failures would never again claim the lives of men under his watch. Ensign Tommy Richardson had been assigned to Mac's detail just 2 months prior, carrying his own invisible wounds. The son of a factory owner who had profited handsomely from defense contracts, Tommy bore the shame of privilege in a war where working-class boys died while the wealthy found safe positions behind desks. His decision to volunteer for the most dangerous assignments was his desperate attempt at redemption, though Mac saw through the young man's bravado to the terrified boy beneath. The fatal flaw had revealed itself during routine stress tests on the Phoenix caissons, the massive concrete structures that would form the backbone of the artificial harbors. A microscopic metallurgical defect in a series of critical bolts, caused by wartime steel rationing, would cause catastrophic failure under North Sea conditions. The discovery had come too late. Thousands of the defective components had already been installed across the entire Mulberry fleet. Eleanor Hartwell, the brilliant but haunted metallurgist who had discovered the defect, paced the workshop like a caged animal. Her husband had died at Monte Cassino, and she had thrown herself into her work with the fervor of the damned, determined that her expertise would help end the war that had stolen her future. The weight of her discovery threatened to crush her. If the Mulberry harbors failed during the invasion, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers would be stranded on hostile beaches, easy prey for German counterattacks. The impossible mathematics were brutally simple. Replacing the defective bolts would require a minimum of 6 weeks, pushing D-Day into July when weather conditions and German reinforcements would make success nearly impossible. Winston Churchill himself had declared that failure to launch by early June would mean postponing the invasion until 1945, a delay that would cost countless lives on the Eastern Front and potentially allow Germany to complete its secret weapons programs. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story of wartime engineering and impossible choices, I'd love to know where you're watching this from. Drop a comment below and let us know what country or city you're in, It's amazing to think we're sharing this piece of history with viewers from around the world. The security implications were equally terrifying. German intelligence had already begun probing for information about Allied invasion preparations. Any delay or unusual activity around the Mulberry components would inevitably leak, potentially exposing the entire Normandy deception plan. The lives of French resistance fighters, British double agents, and Allied soldiers depended on maintaining the facade that everything was proceeding according to plan. In the sterile confines of a Portsmouth conference room, Mac found himself facing a moral abyss that would have broken lesser men. Colonel James Crawford, the project's military overseer, laid out their options with the cold precision of a surgeon describing an amputation. They could report the defect and watch the invasion collapse into postponement and disaster. Or they could stay silent, implement emergency field modifications, and pray that battlefield ingenuity could overcome engineering reality. Tommy Richardson sat beside Mac, his young face pale with the weight of secrets that could reshape history. Eleanor Hartwell's hands trembled as she reviewed her calculations for the dozenth time, desperately searching for an error that might absolve her of responsibility for the choice that lay ahead. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of shipyard hammers and the heavy breathing of four people who suddenly held the fate of the free world in their hands. The conspiracy began with a handshake and a lie that would haunt them all. Colonel Crawford's weathered face betrayed nothing as he outlined their desperate plan. They would quietly identify and mark the most critical defective components, create a secret network of field engineers equipped with emergency replacement bolts, and pray that rapid battlefield repairs could prevent catastrophic failure during the crucial first 72 hours of the invasion. Mac found himself thrust into the role of unwilling architect, tasked with selecting which sailors and engineers could be trusted with fragments of the truth. Each recruitment felt like a betrayal of everything he believed about military honor. Petty Officer James Hammer Morrison, a gruff welder from Detroit whose 3 sons were already fighting in Italy, became their first convert when Mac showed him stress fracture photographs that made the tough man's face go white with understanding. The psychological toll was immediate and devastating. Tommy Richardson began suffering panic attacks during routine inspections, his patrician composure cracking under the weight of deception. He would disappear for hours, found later vomiting behind supply sheds or sitting motionless in empty barracks, staring at photographs of landing craft that might soon become floating coffins. Mac watched the young ensign's idealism curdle into something darker, more pragmatic, and infinitely more dangerous. Hartwell threw herself into developing emergency repair protocols with manic intensity, working 18-hour shifts that left her gaunt and hollow-eyed. She requisitioned materials through a labyrinth of false requisitions and buried authorizations, creating a paper trail so complex that no single person could trace it back to the truth. Her laboratory became a shrine to impossible mathematics, walls covered with calculations that proved, again and again, that their plan was built on wishful thinking and desperation. The first crack in their conspiracy came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chin, a Navy intelligence officer investigating supply irregularities, noticed the unusual patterns in Hartwell's requisitions. Chen had survived the attack on Pearl Harbor by being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the experience had left her with an almost supernatural ability to detect deception. Her investigation threatened to unravel everything just 3 weeks before D-Day. Mac's confrontation with Chen in a dimly lit Portsmouth pub revealed the true cost of their choices. The intelligence officer's dark eyes bore into his soul as she laid out the evidence of their deception with prosecutorial precision. But instead of demanding answers, she asked a question that shattered his remaining certainty. "Chief, what if you're wrong? What if staying silent kills more men than speaking up?" The betrayal came from within their own circle. Petty Officer Morrison, haunted by visions of his sons drowning because of faulty equipment, broke under the psychological pressure and attempted to report the conspiracy to Admiral Ramsey's staff. Only Tommy Richardson's desperate intervention, a mixture of blackmail involving Morrison's gambling debts and appeal to his paternal instincts, prevented complete exposure. Speaking of support, if you're finding this story as gripping as we hope, please hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. We're working toward our goal of 1,000 subscribers, And every single one helps us bring you more incredible untold stories from history. Your support means everything. The incident left their group fractured and suspicious. Morrison retreated into sullen compliance, performing his duties with mechanical precision while avoiding eye contact with his co-conspirators. Chen agreed to delay her investigation but made it clear that she expected full disclosure immediately after D-Day, regardless of the outcome. The trust that had bound them together was replaced by something more fragile and infinitely more volatile. Eleanor Hartwell suffered a complete breakdown on June 2nd, found by Mac in her laboratory at 3 a.m., methodically destroying months of research while tears streamed down her face. Between sobs, she confessed her terror that their silence would result in a disaster that would dwarf her husband's death in its scope and brutality. Mac spent the rest of the night talking her back from the edge, but both knew that her fragile stability was held together by nothing more than stubborn hope and pharmaceutical assistance. The final test of their resolve came in the form of intercepted German intelligence reports suggesting that enemy agents had detected unusual activity around the Mulberry components. The possibility that their desperate secrecy had actually aided German reconnaissance efforts sent shockwaves through the group. Had their attempts to prevent one disaster inadvertently enabled another? As June 5th dawned gray and stormy, postponing the invasion by 24 hours, Max stood on the Portsmouth docks watching the greatest armada in human history preparing for battle. Around him, tens of thousands of young men, Americans, British, Canadians, French, made final preparations for a journey that many would not survive. In his pocket, he carried a list of critical components that might fail at the worst possible moment, and in his heart, he carried the crushing weight of decisions that no human being should ever have to make. The die was cast, the secret was buried, and the fate of the free world now rested on the shoulders of men who knew that victory and catastrophe were separated by nothing more than the tensile strength of compromised steel and the desperate ingenuity of sailors fighting for their lives. June 6, 1944 to 06:30 hours, off Omaha Beach, the first Phoenix caisson struck the seabed with a thunderous crash that reverberated through the hulls of nearby vessels like the death knell of civilization. Mac O'Sullivan watched through binoculars from the deck of HMS Centurion, his throat constricting as he saw the massive concrete structure settle into position exactly as planned. Around him, the greatest naval bombardment in history was reaching its crescendo, but all he could hear was the phantom sound of metal beginning to fail. First unit positioned successfully, Tommy Richardson reported, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The young ensign had volunteered for the forward observation post, desperate to witness firsthand whether their conspiracy would save lives or doom them all. Through the smoke and spray, he could see American GIs beginning their deadly sprint across the killing fields of Omaha Beach, unaware that their lifeline depended on components that should have been replaced weeks ago. The radio crackled with reports from along the 50-mile invasion front. Gold Beach, Juno Beach, Sword Beach, one by one, the Mulberry Harbor components were falling into place with clockwork precision. But Mac knew the real test would come with the first major storm, when the North Sea would test every weld, every bolt, every prayer they had embedded in those floating lifelines. Eleanor Hartwell huddled in the communications center below decks, monitoring stress readings transmitted from sensors she had secretly installed throughout the harbor structures. Her makeshift monitoring system represented months of covert work, jury-rigged equipment that could provide early warning if catastrophic failure was imminent. The readings were within acceptable parameters, but she knew from her calculations that they were dancing on the edge of disaster. At 1,347 hours, the first crisis struck. Phoenix Unit 7, positioned at the critical eastern approach to the American sector, began showing stress readings that made Eleanor's blood run cold. The defective bolts were beginning to fail under the combined pressure of heavy seas and the constant pounding of supply vessels. If the unit collapsed, it would create a domino effect that could destroy the entire artificial harbor and strand the American forces without supplies or reinforcements. Mac's emergency repair team, led by Petty Officer Morrison, launched toward the failing structure in a small craft laden with replacement bolts and welding equipment. The journey across the choppy waters was a nightmare of enemy artillery fire and burning debris from destroyed landing craft. Morrison, driven by paternal fury and professional pride, worked with supernatural efficiency despite the chaos erupting around them. The repair operation became a hellish dance of precision engineering performed under impossible conditions. Morrison and his team welded new supports while German 88mm shells screamed overhead, their work illuminated by the muzzle flashes of distant artillery duels. Mac coordinated from the command vessel, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the radio while watching American boys die on the beaches below. The moment of ultimate betrayal came at 1623 hours, when Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chin discovered the truth in the most brutal way possible. Her inspection of Phoenix Unit 12 revealed hairline fractures that could only have resulted from the metallurgical defects Eleanor had identified weeks earlier. The realization that the invasion force was dependent on compromised equipment sent her into a rage that bordered on madness. Chen's confrontation with Mac over the radio was heard by dozens of officers across the fleet, her voice cutting through the battle noise with accusations that threatened to unravel everything they had worked to protect. "You've sent these boys to die on a foundation of lies," she screamed, her professional composure shattered by the scope of the deception. "How many more have to die for your cowardice?" The psychological breaking point came when Morrison's repair team, working desperately to prevent the collapse of Phoenix Unit 7, was caught in a direct hit from German artillery. The explosion vaporized the small craft and sent 3 men to the bottom of the channel, their sacrifice buying perhaps 6 hours of additional stability for a structure that was fundamentally doomed. Mac watched Morrison's death through binoculars, seeing the older man's body disappear beneath the waves along with any remaining illusions about the nobility of their cause. The weight of command had never felt heavier than in that moment, standing on the deck of a British cruiser while American boys died for secrets he had helped to bury. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. At 1745 hours, as the artificial harbors continued their precarious function, intercepted German communications revealed that enemy intelligence had been aware of the Mulberry Project for weeks. The security breach they had feared had already occurred, but from an entirely different source. Their desperate secrecy had been meaningless, their moral compromises rendered pointless by a German spy network that had penetrated the highest levels of Allied planning. Tommy Richardson received the news in the communications center, his young face aging a decade in the space of a single radio transmission. The realization that they had sacrificed their integrity, their sleep, and their consciences for nothing was almost too much to bear. Around them, the invasion continued with relentless momentum, but the cost of their choices had become immeasurably higher than they had ever imagined. As night fell over the blood-stained beaches of Normandy, Max stood alone on the deck, watching supply convoys navigate between the artificial breakwaters that had cost so much to build and even more to hide. The harbors were holding, the invasion was succeeding, but the price of victory had been measured in more than just blood and steel. It had been paid in the currency of souls, and the accounting was far from complete. 3 months after D-Day, Mac O'Sullivan stood in a sterile Navy tribunal room in London, his dress uniform bearing ribbons that felt like accusations rather than honors. The artificial harbors had held throughout the critical summer months, enabling the Allied breakout from Normandy and the liberation of Paris. By any objective measure, their conspiracy had succeeded beyond their wildest hopes. Yet the 4 surviving members of their group had been summoned to face a reckoning that went far beyond military justice. Admiral Sir Harold Burrough, presiding over the inquiry, possessed the kind of moral authority that made lesser men confess sins they hadn't even committed. His weathered face betrayed nothing as he reviewed the classified files that documented every aspect of their deception, from Eleanor's initial discovery to Morrison's death in the Channel. The room's silence was broken only by the scratch of his pen and the barely audible sobs of Dr. Hartwell, who had been sedated following another breakdown. Tommy Richardson had aged beyond recognition in the months since the invasion. The idealistic ensign had been replaced by a hollow-eyed officer whose hands shook whenever he handled technical reports. His testimony revealed the psychological toll of living with impossible secrets, sleepless nights spent calculating casualty figures, endless replaying of Morrison's final radio transmission, and the crushing weight of wondering whether different choices might have saved lives they would never know about. The strategic analysis presented to the tribunal was both vindication and condemnation wrapped in classified documents. The Mulberry harbors had functioned far longer than their original specifications had promised, enabling the landing of over 2.5 million men and 500,000 vehicles through the artificial ports. The emergency repair protocols developed by Eleanor's team had prevented 17 separate catastrophic failures, each one potentially disastrous enough to compromise the entire invasion timeline. Lieutenant Commander Chen's investigation had uncovered the full scope of the German intelligence penetration that had rendered their secrecy meaningless from the beginning. Agent Cicero, operating from within the British Embassy in Turkey, had transmitted detailed information about the Mulberry Project to Berlin as early as February 1944. The German High Command had chosen not to act on the intelligence, dismissing the artificial harbor concept as impossible Anglo-American fantasy. The bitter irony was inescapable. Their desperate attempts to protect operational security had been redundant from the moment they began. Morrison had died welding repairs on equipment that the Germans already knew about but had chosen to ignore. The psychological trauma inflicted on their entire group had been self-imposed punishment for a crime that existed only in their own minds. Hartwell's analysis of the metallurgical failures revealed that their worst fears had been overstated. While the defective bolts had indeed failed at a higher rate than acceptable peacetime standards, the massive overengineering of the Phoenix units had provided sufficient redundancy to prevent total collapse. Her post-invasion calculations suggested that even complete transparency about the defects might not have delayed D-Day beyond acceptable parameters. The human cost was measured in more than statistics and engineering reports. Mac's marriage had disintegrated under the weight of secrets he couldn't share with his wife, leaving him isolated and drinking heavily in Portsmouth pubs where he wouldn't be recognized. Tommy's father had disowned him after learning about his son's involvement in covering up defects that could have killed American boys, viewing it as the ultimate betrayal of the Richardson family's patriotic legacy. Eleanor Hartwell had retreated into academic obscurity, her brilliant mind fractured by months of impossible moral calculations. She spent her days teaching elementary physics to disinterested schoolchildren, her contributions to the war effort buried in classified files that would remain sealed for decades. The woman who had helped save the invasion had been destroyed by the very success she had enabled. The tribunal's final session focused on the philosophical questions that haunted everyone involved. Admiral Burrow posed the central dilemma with characteristic directness. "Gentlemen, Dr. Hartwell, you faced an impossible choice between certain disaster and probable catastrophe. Your decision saved the invasion, but at what cost to your souls and the principles you swore to uphold?" Mac's response would be quoted in classified military ethics courses for generations. "Sir, we didn't save the invasion. The invasion was always going to succeed because better men than us were willing to die for it. What we did was save ourselves from the responsibility of making a harder choice. We chose the comfortable lie over the difficult truth, and that choice will define us for the rest of our lives." The discovery of Morrison's private journal, recovered from his Portsmouth quarters, provided the most devastating indictment of their conspiracy. The gruff petty officer had documented his growing certainty that their silence was morally indefensible, his plans to resign his position, and his decision to stay only because abandoning the project would have been an even greater betrayal of the men depending on his expertise. His final entry, written on the morning of D-Day, contained a letter to his 3 sons serving in Italy. "Boys, your old man is about to do something that might not be right, but feels necessary. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home to explain. Just remember that sometimes the hardest choice is knowing when to trust others with the truth, even when that truth might hurt them." The tribunal's verdict was sealed and classified, but the personal reckonings continued for decades. Mac eventually found redemption working with Korean War veterans, helping other men process the moral injuries that official recognition could never heal. Tommy Richardson dedicated his post-war life to naval safety regulations, ensuring that future generations of sailors would never face the impossible choices that had defined his youth. Hartwell's story had the most unexpected ending. In 1967, her classified wartime work was finally declassified, revealing her contributions to Allied victory. The scientific community's belated recognition of her achievements led to a second career in materials science, where she spent her remaining years developing safety protocols that would prevent the kind of metallurgical failures that had nearly doomed D-Day. The 5-cent screw that had started their nightmare was preserved in the Imperial War Museum, displayed alongside a placard that told only the sanitized version of the story. Visitors would never know that this tiny piece of metal had been the catalyst for moral choices that haunted 4 people for the rest of their lives, or that the price of victory had been measured in more than blood and treasure. The final truth emerged in 1984, 40 years after D-Day, when the last classified files were released to historians researching the engineering miracles that had made Operation Overlord possible. Mac O'Sullivan, now 73 and dying of lung cancer in a VA hospital, received a visit from a young naval historian who had pieced together the complete story of the Mulberry Harbor conspiracy. As Mac listened to the scholar read from Morrison's recovered journal and Eleanor's decoded research notes, he realized that their terrible secret had been hiding in plain sight all along. The defective bolts, the emergency repairs, the midnight welding sessions under enemy fire, it had all been documented in official reports that bureaucratic classification had buried for 4 decades. The young historian's final question cut through 40 years of guilt like a surgeon's blade. Chief O'Sullivan, knowing what you know now, would you make the same choice again? Mac's answer came without hesitation, his voice barely a whisper but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Son, the choice we made wasn't whether to save the invasion. The invasion was always going to succeed because of men like Morrison and boys like Tommy Richardson. The choice we made was whether to carry the burden of impossible decisions so that others wouldn't have to. And yes, I'd make that choice again, even knowing the cost. The legacy of their conspiracy lived on in the naval engineering protocols that emerged from Eleanor's research, the psychological support systems that Tommy had championed for sailors facing moral injury, and the leadership training that taught officers when transparency serves honor better than secrecy. Their story became a classified case study in military ethics, taught to generations of officers who would face their own impossible choices in wars yet to come. The 5-cent screw that nearly changed the course of World War II serves as an eternal reminder that history's greatest moments often turn on the smallest details and the courage of ordinary people forced to make extraordinary decisions. In the end, Mac O'Sullivan and his reluctant conspirators had discovered that the true cost of victory isn't just measured in blood and steel, but in the moral courage required to carry burdens that others should never have to bear. Their story proves that even in humanity's darkest hours, when faced with impossible choices and unthinkable consequences, the bonds between people determined to protect those they serve can survive even the most devastating betrayals of their own principles. If this incredible story of wartime sacrifice and moral complexity has moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to never miss these powerful untold stories from history. Like this video if it made you think about the hidden costs of the freedoms we enjoy today, and share it with friends who appreciate the complex human drama behind history's greatest moments. What other untold stories from World War II would you like us to explore? Let us know in the comments below. Your suggestions help us bring these forgotten heroes and their impossible choices back into the light where they belong.